Hi guys, I'm Danae Brazel and today I'm going to be talking about the director Sean Baker, and to do this I'm going to basically go over his previous 4 films, so all of the films he has made in the last decade. And I'm going to just get straight into this video really. I don't have any major things to talk about beforehand, but I will say before getting into this that I am only covering his films from the past decade because, to be completely honest, I thought this was his entire filmography, mainly because kind of from Tangerine onwards are the only films of his I've ever really heard people talk about. And I probably should have searched this on Letterboxd earlier than like 2 nights ago, but at that point I'd already watched all 4 of his previous movies from this decade, being Tangerine, The Florida Project, Red Rocket and Anora, and I had also already written and filmed the segments for those videos, and the point was for me to have pieced together my thoughts about his filmmaking in chronological order, so that is why I've not gone back, otherwise I probably would have. But I do feel that these 4 films are the ones that really show kind of the clear style, themes and subject matter that Sean Baker has become known for and also very highly regarded for. So I don't think it's too big of a misstep to only talk about these 4, even though I do think there probably are important influences from his earlier films like Takeout and Starlet. Now, my main question in regards to Sean Baker, having only seen Anora previously when I was going into this, was why he seems specifically interested in the lives of various sex workers as the subjects of his films. Because prior to this, all I had really heard or known of Sean Baker was that he makes films predominantly about sex workers, and that's a pretty vague and limited understanding, which is part of the reason why I wanted to go through his filmography more. And I will say that like this view that I held of his films before this is probably quite a reductive view. Actually, now having seen them, I would say it is a reductive view. But with the knowledge I had going into this, it did feel like a fair question to ask, why he feels like he is the one who is equipped to tell these stories, even if that is probably quite a harsh way of putting it. And then aside from that kind of thing being my central question, I also just knew Sean Baker as being one of kind of the most highly regarded indie filmmakers of the last decade. Also, having only seen Anora, I couldn't quite grasp why, even though I did enjoy that film, but it hadn't fully clicked for me still, like why people were such big fans of Sean Baker, why there seems to be such a cult following of him specifically. So I was really interested to see if with a better view of his filmography as a whole, if I would feel more positively. Okay, I'm going to try filming this outside today. We're going to see how this goes. But obviously, if we are talking about Sean Baker's filmography, we have to start with Tangerine. Now, I would have, if I pre-planned this entire video better, I would have written and filmed this directly after watching it on Thursday when I'm filming this, but instead I didn't do that. I only thought of the ideas for this video yesterday and I already had plans to go see the drama, so this is not directly after watching Tangerine like the rest of these video segments hopefully will be. Also, if the lighting is shit, I don't care. But starting with Tangerine, I think is very interesting for Sean Baker's filmography, and I think really says a lot about where his films go in the future as well. I also think it's a very risky film to make, both in its story and its themes, but also in the way he chose to make this. I think all around is a super risky film, but I think it's a risk that pays off across the board. So starting with the plot of the film, it follows Cindy and her best friend Alexandra on Christmas Eve, after Cindy has been released from a 28-day stint in prison. Also, as always, my notes are over here, that's why. If I'm not looking camera the whole time, you have to get over it. But After learning that her pimp boyfriend Chester has cheated on her during this 28 days, Cindy embarks on a mission to find out if the rumours are true, essentially. And we spend the next 90 minutes following her and Alexandra during this Christmas Eve. And especially Cindy's seeking of answers and, I suppose, revenge at a point for Chester cheating on her. I will say I was going to start with what Tangerine does really well, especially here, which is showing, I think, a side of Los Angeles that I think Hollywood films often seek to avoid. They seek to avoid the fact that it is grungy and dirty, and the really wholly unpleasant reality of living in what is like supposed to be a glamorous like metropolitan utopia, and the way that it's kind of sold to us from other media. This film really highlights that it's like pretty fucking gross a lot of the time. These poorer areas, like these people are struggling and uncomfortable, and it's fucking gross. Like the situations they're kind of forced into as a result of their poverty are fucking gross. Like I don't have a better descriptor for it. And I think this is the conveyance of this like grungy, dirty Los Angeles that we see in the film is highlighted most effectively through Sean Baker's specific style of filmmaking. And I think for him to have such a clear vision as a filmmaker already that really does communicate his ideas this effectively, I think is very impressive. I think what he does here is that he focuses very heavily on the location that his story is set in. And then I think that leads to like the streets of Los Angeles like almost feeling like a living, breathing character in the story, which I think only helps to further enrich everything that we learn about the characters and also the people around them, and even those that we only spend very short stints of time with, or none at all, that we just see in passing. We still kind of know and understand so much about everyone nearby because of how truly alive the setting feels in the film. And I also think he conveys this through his very interesting color grading on this film as well. It's this like bright, almost sickly, high contrast, super like yellow, green, again pretty like gross color grading. It's very abrasive when you first start the film. It's really, yeah, I think sickly is probably my best word for it, but it is very effective as it manages somehow, I think because it's so intense, it manages to both like sterilize some of the more disgusting parts of the setting, but it also does like highlight them in the same way. Like color grading is so distracting that it somehow manages to mask some of the disgusting shit that we are seeing, but it also like almost makes it worse to look at in the same breath, which I think is so interesting. And again, I think it's a really fascinating dichotomy that Sean Baker is working with in this film specifically and through this visual style, because it is such an intense color grade. Like I'd like obviously seen like images of this film before, but turning it on and seeing like that really abrasive color grading is so jarring. But I think it really is great again in conveying the kind of two parts of this setting of Los Angeles and these streets, is that it's distracting and bright and all of these things, but it is also like grungy and dirty and gross. And then as for like the real like filmmaking discussion here, I also have to, as always, highlight that for me the real true hero of Sean Baker's filmmaking and his work in general is his editing. I really do think he is such a talented film editor, and so much of his directing choices work because he understands how to edit in a way that maintains energy and pace throughout the entirety of a film. especially here, like the edit is so fast in places, especially I think the first like 30 minutes of this film is non-stop, and it is full of energy and it's very intense, and I feel like there's so much we're trying to grasp at once to really understand where we're going, but his editing is so well done that you never feel overwhelmed in a way that isn't helpful to the storytelling. I think the kind of overwhelm you do feel is necessary for the plot. And yeah, as always, I really am such a fan of him as a film editor, the same way as I felt after watching Anora as well, which of course are the only two films of his I've seen at this point, is that I think he really understands how to edit a film in a way that manages the energy and pace very effectively. Now I think the thing I really appreciate about Tangerine is that while obviously both of our main characters are trans women and we are aware of that, the film is not about the fact that they are trans. It is about a day in both of their lives with certain aspects of that obviously being informed by their trans identity and by that experience. It is not actually about them being trans. It's not a like quote unquote like trans story movie. It is about two people, and that is just part of their identity and therefore informs it. And I think this is a real success of the film, as I do think a lesser filmmaker would seek to have the trans identity of these two women be the most important part of the story. They would make a story all about that. But we never really talk about it, except for we speak about it in terms of like when Cindy first finds out that Chester cheats on her, like the fact that it was with like a quote-unquote like real woman. Yeah, because they're talking about him cheating on her with a cis woman, and that is the kind of extra offence. And I think that is what makes it so much more interesting, because that is a real conversation these two women would have, versus they're not going to dissect their trans identity together in like a random fucking day where like one of them just gotten out of prison. But I do think a lesser filmmaker and a lesser film would attempt to make them have a sort of like obvious conversation about trans identity, but this film is not about that and therefore doesn't need that conversation, and I'm very glad that Sean Baker understood that when writing this film. I also think the ending is a really beautiful moment of friendship between Cindy and Alexandra, because like ultimately they are united in their shared experiences and offer each other a kind of unending support that they just cannot find anywhere else. I think their dynamic is obviously the driving force of the film, and it's fantastic. Both of those actresses do a phenomenal job. We really believe in like the kind of history of their friendship. Like you can tell early on when Cindy's first kind of going on her warpath, like Alexandra's like, oh, you can tell she's like, I've been here before, I've dealt with her being fucking crazy before. She's like, please don't do this today, you just got out of prison. But I think like their dynamic is such a clear result of like a shared history, and I think that ending is like, despite, you know, what's happened in kind of the previous 20 minutes of the film, I'm obviously not going to spoil it here, but the fact that it doesn't matter because something else happened, and automatically like it doesn't matter that they had any kind of falling out or whatever, because like they are truly united in this experience and understand each other in a very special way as a result of those experiences, and that kind of endless support that they offer each other, you know, will not be impacted by whatever kind of conflicts they may be having at the time. Like those things are ultimately unimportant because they know they need to be united in kind of everything, because obviously like to survive where they are they just need to be. But I think that ending is really beautiful, and that even though it's obviously like the result of a horrific act. Okay, so that's all my like really serious thoughts about the film. I'm just gonna now quickly for the end of this segment talk about some of my more random thoughts during this film. Firstly, Razmik seemed like the most likable character to me to begin with. However, that could not have changed more quickly when it became clear that he's a fucking chaser. Like, what? I was like, I mean, we should have kind of known. Like, in hindsight, like, if I'm going to rewatch this and go, no, he was always giving off a vibe that was strange. But I will say that I find him so interesting because it's also very clear that he has like a good relationship with Alexandra and Cindy, and obviously that is within the boundaries of how that relationship works, obviously in the transactional nature of it. But I do think it's very interesting that they clearly like trust him enough, like of all like the people they're having to go to service, that like clearly it's one of the more positive forms of that relationship for them, and like Alexandra like wants him to go see her sing, even like clearly like there is like some sort of friendship there, even though obviously it's also a transactional relationship, and I do think that's very interesting. And clearly it's like just a part of that work is obviously like having regular customers that they clearly do like seeing. But I do think it's so interesting, Razmik's relationship with his own family, being willing to go out on Christmas Eve to go see Alexandra and Cindy is, I mean, fucking crazy. But no, I found him very interesting. I don't know if I have fully coherent thoughts about Razmik at this point in time. Maybe I'll have more to say once I have seen Sean Baker's entire filmography, how I feel about his kind of character. But I do find it interesting because I found him very likable to begin with, and then it became clear he was a chaser, and I was certainly feeling less positive. But towards the end of the film you feel almost sympathetic, but then also he's kind of just this pathetic man who is, you know, cheating on his wife just to, for what really? Like, we never truly know. And I just have to say, the one thought I really kept having during this film, and again I think is a result of Sean Baker's great film editing, is that every time we cut back to Cindy walking around, it was very funny. Like, seeing whatever Alexandra was doing, and then after they split up, and then cutting back to Cindy just still striding around, walking everywhere. She was just on a fucking mission this entire time. And then of course this only became funnier once she found Dinah. What the entire, every time we cut back to wherever they were still fighting was honestly some of the funniest things I've seen in a film in a while. I found Cindy like delightful and fucking insane, and I really just every time we cut back to her was some of the funniest things I've seen in a film in a while. And yeah, I think that's kind of my total thoughts on Tangerine as of right now. I'm very interested to get to the Florida project. I'm probably going to watch that tonight as of filming this, so or tomorrow. Either way, I'll be getting to that very soon. I'm very interested to see where we go. My brother has been trying to get me to watch the Florida project for so long. I'm finally getting to it, so I'm very excited. But my final thoughts are that I thoroughly enjoyed Tangerine. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I think it was a very risky film to make, as I mentioned before, but especially in 2015, considering its subject matter and what it does with it. I think it is a very risky film to make, especially for an indie filmmaker at the time that, you know, filmed this on an iPhone. I think it is super risky, but I think it's very effective. It's worked out very well, and I think it is funny and poignant, but also kind of gross and horrific, and somehow also heartwarming. So I think Tangerine is a real success of a film overall, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that is my thoughts on that, and I will see you next time to talk about the Florida project, and I hope I feel just as good about that, if not better. Okay, so next up in Sean Baker's filmography is the Florida project, which I watched last night as of filming this, and I guess to get straight into this one, the most basic way of describing the plot of this film is that it is about a 6-year-old girl named Mooney and her friends who all live in motels in Florida, and it essentially follows the lives of people that are forced to live in motels, as that is all they can afford, through the eyes of these children. I almost don't know where to begin with this film other than calling it a masterpiece. I really do think this is a very special piece of work. It is heartwarming and funny, but also pretty devastating, and more than anything else, I think it is distinctly, painfully human. I think it is such a pure, raw distillation of the human experience, and even more so, I think, what is a real display of what it is to truly be childlike in the face of our own difficulties. On the filmmaking side of things, it is once again phenomenal work from Sean Baker. However, I do think the style here is far simpler than Tangerine, and watching it as a follow-up to that is fascinating because it is so different tonally. But I do think the simpler style of the Florida Project works very well and suits the type of story that this film is seeking to tell us. We also don't really see a whole lot of Sean Baker's kind of experimental filmmaking until the final sequence, which I'm not really going to discuss here since I don't want to spoil the film in this video. However, I do think that the choices he makes in that final sequence especially are used to great effect. I really think that final sequence and the change in tone and pace of that is phenomenal, and it is due to the more experimental choices he makes in that final sequence. Yet again, as well for Sean Baker, is the clear importance of setting as kind of another living character in a story, and I think that this purple castle themed motel that is obviously pretty run down as well because of kind of where it is and the fact that people are having to live there full time, is that it really does act as another sort of character in the film. It's so interesting. It really, I think, highlights the dichotomy of what this film is trying to show of both a child's experience in this situation versus an adult one. And through Mooney's perspective, this motel it kind of feels endless and full of opportunities and adventure, but we're also, as an audience, under no illusion as to the kind of reality of living in a place like this and the sort of poverty that forces people into this kind of situation where they have to live in a motel full time because there's nowhere else they can go. So I do think the setting is once again used very well to not only just be kind of a place where the characters are for the sake of it, but also in continuing to convey the ideas that I think Sean Baker is aiming to convey in this film. And also, once again, last thing on the kind of filmmaking side for me here is that it's another great edit from Sean Baker, although I do think it is perhaps a bit less showy in comparison to Tangerine. I, again, think that suits this film very well. This film, I think, requires a lot of simpler things in both the colour grade and the edit, and I'm glad that he chose to make simpler choices here because I think it allows the story to breathe, which is what it desperately needs. So I think, again, it's very interesting in contrast to Tangerine, where everything is so abrasive and suffocating. For this film, that is so much simpler in the edit. There's no crazy colour grading. It's kind of the opposite in many ways, but I think it suits this very well. And yeah, once again, I think a really good edit. I think it maintains pace still, but in a different way, I think, than Tangerine does. Yeah, I really do think the film's greatest strength is the way it is able to show the dichotomy between how the children living in these circumstances experience things versus what the adults around them are going through in order to not only survive, obviously, but also to protect these children as best they can from like the true reality of their poverty. I think what allows these children to still remain so kind of bright and energetic and full of life and childlike wonder is that the adults around them are constantly kind of making an effort to maintain that and protect them as best they can from what is the reality is that like it fucking sucks for these people, and they've been, you know, whatever has happened to them to mean that they've ended up in the sort of position where the only place they can live is a motel, and they're trying to scrape to get the money week by week to stay living there. You know, it's so interesting to watch those two things in contrast, and I think the film does it very well by when we see the children versus when we kind of see the more adult perspective of things, which I do think we start getting more and more of in the back half of the film. And it's also not as though the children, especially Mooney, are unaware of their circumstances either in that protection. Like, we hear Mooney say that they're broke and that they have no money on several occasions. However, she still has this like childlike wonder. So she's, you know, because of the protection of the adults around her, she is not forced to reckon with how truly dire things are for them. And a large part of that is due to the adults around her, like Hayley and Bobby, who kind of continue to indulge her whims a lot of the time. They are kind of just willing to entertain whatever Mooney is doing in order to kind of maintain and protect her like childlike wonder still. And I think it's really beautiful, even though she clearly, like in some ways, is kind of too mature for a 6-year-old because of their circumstances and understands some things that are going on far more than she should. That childishness, and I mean that in the most positive sense, is still protected because of the adults around. And I think that is something the film shows incredibly well, and the kind of importance of that I think is conveyed so incredibly here. And then on to my more random thoughts watching this. First of all, like character-wise, I do think we have to talk about Hayley a little bit. I think ultimately she is doing her absolute best. However, their circumstances ultimately do force her to make poor choices that end up having devastating consequences. Again, I'm not going to talk about what those are because that would spoil the end of the film, but it is truly unfortunate, you know, the kind of choices she has to make. And again, if you know about Sean Baker films in general, then you can probably guess the kind of choices she has to make money so they can keep affording their room at the motel. But it is ultimately devastating that she's forced into it, and the other consequences of those choices she is forced into as well are truly heartbreaking, and like that end sequence is so difficult because of it. And I also have to talk about Bobby, who I think is a really special character, and that is in part due to Willem Dafoe's incredible performance, but also because I think of what kind of Bobby represents as a character and the kind of man he is. Like, you know, this is a man that so clearly cares for all of the residents at this motel, and especially the children, but all of these people. And he really is trying his best within, you know, the boundaries he has to work with. He really is trying his best to help these people make it through whatever has put them in this current position. At the very least, he can offer them some semblance of a home, again, within the boundaries that he has to work with. But I really do think he is such an interesting character, and one that I could watch so much of. I could watch him interact, I feel like, with every person that stays here, and we would get a different, like, heartbreaking, also beautiful story from it. And I really do think, like, someone that gives such unending support, even though he's clearly also exhausted and frustrated dealing with these people a lot of the time, he also just genuinely, like, fucking cares about them. And I think it is such a beautiful display of empathy from his character. I think one of my favourite shots in the film is kind of like that hero shot of him after he turns the power back on and everyone is like standing outside their doors cheering, and I think it's this really beautiful moment of community in the film, and also really highlights how everyone does like appreciate this man and like the fact that he is doing his best to care for these people, you know, even though they clearly, I think, take a lot of their frustrations out on him as well, obviously, as the motel manager, but that at the core of it, like, all of the people here care about him and are grateful for the community that he is offered in this place. And so ultimately, I think the Florida Project is incredible. It's a 5 out of 5 star film for me, not even a question there. I think it is, yeah, truly incredible, probably one of the best films of the last decade, and once again I think it is a masterful showing of humanity from Sean Baker, with a real like empathy that radiates from this film. I think that's the biggest takeaway of this film, even in the more unsavory and like painful parts of it, as it is a film that I think radiates such empathy. Okay, so the next film we need to talk about is Red Rocket, which is a very interesting, I think, film to discuss within Sean Baker's filmography. It is about a former porn star named Mikey Saber who returns to his hometown in Texas to stay with his estranged wife and mother-in-law, and kind of right as he begins to settle back into his life there, he meets a young donut shop worker named Strawberry, who he very quickly becomes infatuated with. As kind of with all of Sean Baker's films, the plot is very simple, and I'd say it takes place over a very short period of time as well. I think that's a real point of consistency in his filmmaking. But I must say that I really feel like I'm going to struggle with discussing this film because it feels like such a strange departure from Baker's other films, even though its setting, subject matter and overall tone are very similar, especially to that of the Florida Project. We'll start with that. On the filmmaking side of things, I do think that this film feels very similar to the Florida Project, both in the colour grading and editing of it, so I don't really have a lot to say in that regard. However, I will say that just like in his other films, these things are very good. He, once again, is great at editing. I will say the one thing that I'm learning going through Sean Baker's entire filmography is that like none of his films ever feel like they're dragging, which I think is very impressive to do across multiple films. I think, yeah, as I've said before, a great editor, and yeah, this is another example of that. Otherwise, I will say that I do think setting is less important to the plot of this film than it was in Tangerine and the Florida Project, although I do still think it informs a lot of our characters' behaviours and identities. However, I do think these things are more influenced by living in a low-income area in the United States and less about like this town specifically, whereas I think there is something uniquely Floridian about the Florida Project, and there's something very uniquely Los Angeles about Tangerine. I think there's less of that here. However, I do still think like the setting is an influence, but I don't think it is kind of treated with the same like character as it is in Sean Baker's previous films. I also think Red Rocket makes an interesting departure from Sean Baker's other films, because we are, in both Tangerine and the Florida Project, really supposed to empathise with the characters, sometimes like even in spite of their misgivings, because I think we are given enough so that we understand the choices they make. And we understand that those poor choices are a result of circumstance and the limited options they are afforded due to their class position. However, in this film, Mikey is blatantly unlikable, even though he is funny and entertaining, because ultimately, more than anything else, he is delusional, arrogant, and selfish. and he is also like pretty objectively gross, sleazy, and predatory. Mikey spends this entire 2-hour runtime constantly bragging about his porn career and clearly making up complete bullshit a lot of the time, which most of the people around him clearly don't believe, but they still entertain anyway for whatever reason. But he essentially lives in a complete fantasy land where he believes he is important and deserving of fame and recognition, when that just isn't true. You know, and especially I think the greatest display of Mikey's true character is his entire relationship with Strawberry, which made my fucking skin crawl the entire time. She is a 17-year-old girl who works at the donut shop, and he starts off by annoyingly hanging around her while she's working, and then proceeds to start a sexual relationship with her, where he very quickly starts to try and convince her to do porn. And all of this takes place while he is still also stringing along his wife and mother-in-law, convincing them that he is now going to stay and continue to support them financially, which they clearly need. Oh god, this entire relationship, obviously the point is that it is gross and that he is being predatory and sleazy, but it really is like so hard to watch. Like my skin, which is, oh, I was fucking crawl out of my skin watching this man. And then the fact that he's constantly telling other people about how she'll be perfect to do porn, it's like, holy shit, dude. Like, this guy just fucking sucks. And it is also very clear that, like, Mikey's circumstances, though unfortunate, are a direct result of his poor decision making, whereas in Sean Baker's other films, the characters are forced to make their worst choices by their circumstances. And while Mikey obviously comes from a low income area, which I am sure drives a lot of his obsession with Hollywood, success, and fame, he is ultimately responsible for the current state of his life. Therefore, I think it is far more difficult to empathize with him, as his complete lack of self-awareness becomes more and more grating as the film goes on. You know, it's like one point where he like essentially tries to scare off Strawberry's high school boyfriend, and like he's just like preying on the naivety of this girl and trying to promise her wealth and success and fame, because those are all things that are so unattainable to the people that live in a place like this, but they're also unattainable to Mikey. And so I just think the more time we spend with him, the worse his behaviour feels, and the more grossed out I think we become as an audience watching this fucking man just constantly chat shit and then wreak havoc with an event that takes place towards the end of the film. And it's kind of a moment, again, I'm not talking about spoilers in this video, but it's kind of a moment of the film where you think he might have a change of heart, and the fact that he doesn't change at all, nothing about him improves after causing something truly awful, I think is really the final straw of like being unable to empathize with this man, because he's ultimately just like delusional, useless shit. And like it got to a point that throughout the film I was so genuinely annoyed that I thought I disliked the film itself. But I actually think, you know, after sitting with it for a day, that I think Red Rocket is very good. But I was just so distracted by the fact that I wanted to fucking punch Mikey for the entire 2-hour runtime that for a lot of it I was convinced I hated the movie. Okay, my camera overheated as I was giving my closing thoughts on Red Rocket, but yeah, I was just saying that it is my lowest rated so far in Sean Baker's filmography, although I still do think it is very good. I think if the humour works for you, you'll really like it, but I also think being able to tolerate Mikey Saber for the entire runtime is also part of it, and I do think that's why I probably feel a little less positive, because I struggle to empathise with him. I don't think the aim though is to empathise with him, which is why I think this is such an interesting entry in Sean Baker's filmography, because all of his other films really want us to empathise with the characters and their circumstances, but I really don't think that is the intention here. I think Mikey is too self-serving and ultimately delusional for that to be the case. But yeah, I'm very interested to see how I feel going into my rewatch of Anora. This will be my third time watching Anora next. And I'm very interested to see how I will feel about it now. So far, I do think he is a fantastic filmmaker. And I think lots of my more harsh kind of questioning of the subject matter he chooses has been quelled now watching this, and I think, yeah, he deserves all of the praise he's kind of given. This is a phenomenal series of works that he has produced so far, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this experience. Even though Red Rocket has been my least favourite so far, I will say 4 stars, I think is a very good least favourite. Okay, so finally we're at the point where I can talk about Anora. So unlike the other films in this video, I have seen Anora previously. I've seen it twice before. I think it's been about a year since the last time I watched it. Let me check. Okay, so the last time I watched Anora prior to this was the 16th of May 2025, and I watched it for the first time on the 9th of January 2025. So it's been about a year since I'd last seen Anora, and I was super interested to see how I would feel about the film now with the additional context of the rest of Sean Baker's filmography. And yeah, we'll get into this one. So basically, Anora is about a young sex worker from Brooklyn named Anora, who meets and impulsively marries Ivan, who is the son of a Russian oligarch, and she kind of believes that this is her chance to improve her circumstances. However, that fairy tale is very quickly threatened once his parents order for the marriage to be annulled. So to start off with this one, from a filmmaking point of view, I really do think that Anora is some of Sean Baker's best work. Specifically, the editing and pacing in the first 45 minutes is truly phenomenal. It really maintains a lot of energy because I think it is so well paced and the editing is so good. It is, yeah, full of energy, and it's this fast-paced editing that really suits the kind of whirlwind that Annie is becoming caught up in with Ivan. And especially that entire wedding sequence in Vegas might be Sean Baker's best work in any of his films. I think that sequence is truly phenomenal. The music choices, the editing, everything about it, the way it's shot, I love that sequence. I've always enjoyed it every time I watch Anora, but specifically this time around I think I could finally fully appreciate it because I now have his other work to kind of compare and contrast it with. Now, in saying that, I must say that of Sean Baker's films, I do think that Anora is the least informed by its setting. I think it focuses more heavily on the dynamics and kind of culture within a strip club versus being about Brooklyn. And maybe that's just, I don't know a lot about like Brooklyn culture. It might be super informed and that is my mistake, but I feel like specifically again in Tangerine and the Florida Project, the setting is such a vital character to the film versus I don't really feel that way about it watching Anora. I think the film spends more time with kind of the character that Annie puts on for others, such as Ivan, than it does with Anora as a complete person, except for I guess a couple of moments earlier on, like when she's going back home on the train, and obviously the very end of the film where we see her kind of break down and see her kind of reckoning with the consequences of kind of getting swept up in this fairy tale. And now I do think the film could benefit from spending a little more time away from the performed persona of Annie and more time with Anora the person, because I do think this may have helped the audience to understand her motivations better, especially because I think for a broader audience, I don't know if some of her choices could be really easily inferred. I also think of Sean Baker's films that this one focuses the least on these financial circumstances that drive people to engage in sex work, and I think instead places a greater emphasis on the fantasy that Annie wants to believe in instead. And you know, she is so desperate to believe in the fantasy that Ivan offers her, that we kind of see Honora ignore her instincts that she clearly has earlier on in the film. Like, she clearly is quite perceptive, and so there's something quite all-knowing about her in a way. And I think to her it feels like the part where they get married, like, she interprets that as maybe a more real and serious choice, which I think is part of the reason why she begins to truly buy into the life that Ivan seems to be offering her. And once things start to unravel, I believe that her devastation is more a result of realizing that the fairy tale ending that she had started to believe in wasn't real, versus it being really about any true love that she may have for Ivan. I think she sees this marriage as a way out of not only sex work, but also out of financial hardship, and as like kind of the means of maybe finally having more for herself. And again, while we do view her as quite mature and knowing, and there's something worldly about her, I think this is, again, like, for that line of work, there's a certain level of kind of perceptiveness that is needed. And I do think, like, we kind of view her as mature and knowing in that way. But I think we need to remember as an audience that she is only 23, and more than anything else, because of her circumstances, she wants to believe that she can have more than her current life is offering. And Ivan essentially dangles this possibility in front of her for a week or two. And while that isn't a long time, it's long enough for her to, one, cause serious damage to her real personal life. But it also, I think, does give her long enough where she starts to truly buy into the fantasy. And again, I think getting married is really where she starts to believe in it as something true. Because for her, I do think she kind of wants to believe in the Cinderella story about there being a happy ending to this, and like the fantasy being real enough, and I think marriage feels like a signal that it could be for her. And unfortunately, she does truly buy into the fantasy at that point, or at least it feels like she does. I think she wants to as much as possible, and I do think the marriage kind of is the point where maybe she truly starts to believe it's possible. Now, I have to say that Mikey Madison's performance in this movie only gets better every time I watch it. I think there are so many little nuanced moments that you cannot pick up on a first watch that really do make what I already thought to be a very good performance truly great. I think she really is phenomenal here. And I also have to say that Yuri Borisov is the other kind of real standout performance for me. I think he offers a real support to Honora as Igor, and since he is the only other character here that seems to truly regard her as a real person, you know, he can see like this is like ultimately a young girl that has been kind of manipulated and lied to and had this fantasy dangled in front of her. And yeah, he's kind of the only one that's like, this is still a person. I think all the other people around are only concerned with, well, that is a sex worker, and the kind of view that she is worthless for that. And so I think Igor is a really interesting character, and the kind of contrast he adds because he does view her as a real person. And again, I think Yuri Borisov's performance only does great things to support that. And now, overall, I really do think Honora is a great film. On my previous watches, I had given it 4 stars. However, I have bumped it up to a 4.5 this time. I think it's a really great film. I think it's certainly a very entertaining movie. And I also think it marks a really interesting point in Sean Baker's filmography, as in many ways it seems to show like kind of what could be perceived as the most traditional portrayal of a sex worker in media. And what I mean when I say that is like, you know, a kind of like early 20s stripper who like gets married to like some rich Russian, and he like sweeps her off her feet, and they get caught up in this fantasy, but it isn't real. Like that feels like a pretty traditional kind of portrayal of a sex worker, and it's kind of a more predictable type of story about this kind of subject matter in comparison to Sean Baker's other films. However, I think he takes this idea and both expands on it, but also really humanizes it. So the reality of these women is very clear, as well as the kind of, I think, fantasy that people in less fortunate circumstances are so desperate to believe could become a reality for them. I think that's the true tragedy of Anora, is people that so desperately want more than their circumstances have offered them, and having, you know, maybe a single moment where it feels possible that they could actually have more, and then that simply just not be true. I think that is the true devastation, that not everyone gets to have their kind of fairy tale or their fantasy come true, and the, you know, real life circumstances they're left with are less than ideal, you know, putting it lightly. And yeah, I really do think that is a tragedy in general, and I think this film highlights that more than anything else. You know, we as a viewer, even, we get caught up in the fantasy of Annie and Ivan. It's funny and ridiculous and it feels over the top, but ultimately there's a point where the fantasy ends and we come to the realization it isn't real, even if we as a viewer maybe never truly believed it going in, because we were skeptical, and also we know it's a film, there has to be kind of a conflict taking place. But yeah, I really do think the film highlights the kind of devastation of wanting more than it feels like you can have, and I think Annie thought maybe she could have more, and it's truly, again, devastating that it looks like she can't, or at least at this point in her life she can't, and the fantasy couldn't be real for her. Now, I must say that watching Sean Baker's filmography really has made me such a fan of his work. I can really genuinely say now I'm such a fan of his work. I think he is really skilled at getting an audience to empathise with a character and their circumstances. And I think he does this through the use of his really, I think, unique and interesting filmmaking style. I think he has a very clear style that is very identifiable to him. And I think, yeah, these 4 films have all been fantastic. I mean, my lowest rating was for Red Rocket, and that's still a 4-star movie for me. So I think that says all I really need to, that, you know, the movie I liked the least is still a 4-star film. Shows I think this is a fantastic series of films to have produced. Now, obviously, as I spoke about in the intro to this video, my main question going into this was why Sean Baker feels that he is the one that is equipped to handle the various stories of sex workers. And obviously, sex workers are portrayed very poorly in media, so I was genuinely very curious as to why Sean Baker feels that he is capable of doing so more successfully and more empathetically. But I must say that after watching these 4 films, I can so easily say that Sean Baker really does know how to handle this subject matter with the sort of nuance and empathy and understanding necessary for these representations to be positive. Now, obviously, this is only from my perspective. I'm not a sex worker, so obviously there is like limitations to me saying that. However, I really think he's great at kind of addressing the subject matter with a lot of nuance and humanity, and I think he also manages to put together these really positive portrayals of these people without overly sanitizing the less comfortable parts of these discussions. And ultimately, I do feel that he has done very well in these films in achieving his goal of working to destigmatize sex work. Because after watching these films, I did, you know, want to go read and watch some of his interviews about this and why he was so interested in sex work as kind of subject matter for his films. And he said ultimately he just wants to do more to destigmatize it, you know, legitimize the fact that sex work is real work, but also, yeah, try to work against some of the stigma that is so built up around sex work in our society as a whole. And I think what makes his films so good in working to do this is that all 4 of these films I've spoken about in this video tackle the subject matter differently, citing different motivations and circumstances that lead to these characters' choices. In both Tangerine and The Florida Project, the fact that these characters are sex workers is not central to the story, but simply more of an informing factor of their characters and choices. And when I say this, I mean that in Tangerine, while Cindy and Alexandra clearly work on the streets of Los Angeles, and we do even see Alexandra service someone at one point, their work is more important to the film in the way that it informs how they operate versus it being the central plot of the film. It is solely an informing factor and a kind of, I guess, a minor plot point versus being what the film is actually about thematically. And in The Florida Project, we know that Haley lost her job at the strip club because she refused to service patrons, and eventually she is forced into prostitution as a way of making rent. However, for the majority of the film, sex work is not a part of the plot. And when it does become a choice that Haley is forced to make, we are more concerned with the consequences for Mooney and Haley than with the sex work itself. And then Red Rocket and Nora, on the other hand, are centered around protagonists whose jobs as sex workers I think are more central to the plot. So it is more directly important for their character arcs. However, these films I think seek to show who these characters are outside of this, and more importantly I think these films are about what they are willing to believe in the hopes of one day having a better life than what is currently offered to them. In Red Rocket, Mikey's time in the porn industry has certainly helped to inflate his ego, which I'm already assuming was rather large and overbearing prior. And I think it's also given him the impression that he is viewed as successful. And so I think this makes his time in sex work an integral part of his character, and it also I think informs a lot of his behaviour with Strawberry and what he is convinced he can kind of offer to her, you know, to get what he wants from that relationship, and the way he can prey upon her by kind of dangling opportunity in front of her, I think it's only possible because of his prior experiences in sex work and in the porn industry. And then in Anora, Annie meets Yvonne at the club where she works, and their relationship very quickly progresses from what is a transactional professional relationship there, and it very quickly transforms into something that is convincing her of a fantasy that she so desperately wants to be a reality. And that is a fantasy where she is offered both financial stability and comfort, as well as I think like genuine love and care. And I think, as I spoke about in the Anora section of this video, that for her the act of getting married was a more genuine act of love, some form of love for her, and she thought that maybe genuine affection like that could be offered to her and not just the transaction and the hope at a monetary gain. I also think that Sean Baker is really, really good at making films that portray the lives of people living in low-income communities and how these circumstances drive people's decisions. Some have previously criticised his films as being poverty porn. However, I think they are great at getting an audience to empathise with those in these communities, as a lot of the media we consume tends to villainise the impoverished or assign blame to them for circumstances they cannot control. Some people, especially in the United States, are just simply excluded from the traditional economic system and are forced into financial hardship for various reasons. And I feel that Sean Baker's films really try to expand an audience's understanding of what life can look like for these people without making them a joke or a villain, because I do often think that our media wants to either make the poor the butt of the joke or the villain of the story. But he simply tells these as survival stories. It is simply people doing what they can to get by with whatever they have offered to them, how very little they have offered to them. It is simply what they are able to do with that in order to survive. And I think what makes these portrayals even more effective is that these characters are still flawed. You know, it's not as though Baker presents them as perfect people who have never made poor choices, but rather they are complex people that are attempting to make the best out of what they have. And while this should be the bare minimum in film and in media in general, portraying those who are less fortunate as complete human beings with flaws and wants and dreams and desires and poor choices and all is often not what is done. And so I think Sean Baker's consistent choice across all of his films to tell these sort of nuanced stories about not only sex workers but also those living in impoverished communities feels pretty radical. And I think that is the true kind of positive takeaway for me with Sean Baker's films, is that I think they are truly radical in what they choose to show of America, of the impoverished, of those who are struggling, that gives them a real heart and soul, which obviously in reality those people do have, but gives that in media, which I think is a truly radical choice. And I think to also make a real serious effort towards the destigmatization of sex work by portraying these people as complete and, again, truly wanting of things and truly hopeful for things is incredible work. And I think it is so well done across his filmography, and I can easily say that after making this video and going through this process of watching Sean Baker's films, that I am so truly a fan of him and his work, and I had a great time watching these. These films are also just so entertaining and engaging. I really have nothing bad to say. I have no real criticisms to make here, because I think it is such solid, great filmmaking. I think it is conveying messages, themes and stories that are truly positive and radical and important. So yeah, those are all of my thoughts on Sean Baker's films for the past decade. As I've said, I loved watching these films. I loved making this video. I had a really fun time doing it, and I hope you guys like the slightly different format. Let me know if you did. I had a lot of fun I think trying something different with this video, so I hope it turns out. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please hit the like button, and if you would like to see even more from me, please hit subscribe. And if you would like to see even more from me, you can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Letterboxd. All those things are linked down below, and over there you can see more of my film thoughts on Letterboxd. Also on Instagram you can keep up with kind of what I'm doing, and also my makeup and special effects work and whatever else. But yeah, that'll be all from me today. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.